Welcome back, friends. Tonight's story walks the knife's edge between glory and horror. We're not just recounting ancient events, we're peeling back a legacy so carefully varnished, it's become a mirror for modern power. This isn't the sanitized version found in museum plaques or high school textbooks. It's the deeper cut, the raw, buried truth. And if some parts feel eerily modern, that's no coincidence. Before we descend into the story, take a slow breath, dim the lights, and if you're drawn to these forgotten truths, these echoes of empire, tap that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support doesn't just keep the lights on, it keeps the past from being buried twice. What if the man celebrated as the father of unified China was also one of history's most cold-blooded tyrants? What if his legacy of order and greatness came soaked in the blood of scholars and the sweat of slaves? Millions of tourists line up every year to marvel at his Terracotta Army. His name is taught to school children as a builder, a unifier, a visionary, but that's only the mask. The real story is darker. It begins with a boy king raised in political chaos, who rose to rule through ruthless conquest and unrelenting fear. A ruler whose paranoia scorched the culture around him, literally. Burning books, burying dissenters, building walls not just of stone, but of silence. And yet, his story is still held up as a triumph. How did this happen? How did mass murder become national myth? This is not the story of national pride. This is the story of how historical glorification can launder tyranny, of how the tools of oppression, censorship, surveillance, forced labor can be recast as visionary leadership. It's about what gets remembered and what gets erased. Qin Shi Huang's name may stand atop the foundations of a civilization, but it was built over the bones of resistance. This story is for them, for the silenced, for the erased, for the truths no dynasty dares to teach. Tonight, we pull back the curtain and walk through the ashes of China's first and most feared emperor. What kind of boy inherits a kingdom at 13 and lives to unify a continent in blood? Yingzheng was born into warfare, 259 BCE, to the ruling house of Qin, just another minor noble in a fragmented land. His birth was not glorious. Some chronicles whisper he was illegitimate, a pawn in courtly scandals tied to his mother Zhao Ji and her lover, the traitor Lao Ai. At 3, his father left him behind as a hostage in the rival state of Zhao, his earliest memories steeped in humiliation. By 13, his father died, and Zheng ascended as king of Qin, guided by a ruthless minister, Lu Bue. Lu, once his mother's rumored lover and perhaps his real father, became regent, but not protector. Palace life was no sanctuary. It was a nest of vipers, affairs, assassins, and plots festered beneath the brocade. Lao Ai, elevated by Lu, staged a coup with the Queen Dowager. When it failed, Zheng responded with merciless clarity. Lao Ai was torn apart by horses in the city square. His sons, infants, were smashed to death. His own mother was placed under lifelong house arrest, vanishing from public life like a shamed spirit. This was no ordinary childhood. It was a crucible that forged paranoia into policy. At 15, he began assuming real power and quickly made it clear mercy was not a tool he valued. Zheng turned to legalism, a philosophy forged in iron. Reward loyalty, punish dissent, eliminate ambiguity. Laws multiplied, informants were paid. Whole families could be executed for one man's betrayal. Dissenters found their tongues cut out, sometimes their limbs, too. But amid terror, order grew. The Qin state swelled in strength. Zheng's eyes looked eastward. to the 6 rival kingdoms splintering the land like a shattered bowl. He began by conquering Han, the weakest. His generals, among them the brutal Wang Jian, razed cities methodically. Then Zhao, the state that once held him hostage, fell after a campaign soaked in vengeance. Some towns were depopulated, residents vanished, relocated, or slain to prevent rebellion. In Yan, an assassin nearly killed Zheng. Afterward, retaliation was savage. Yan's royalty hunted down and eliminated. The kingdom of Wei capitulated quickly. Qi, isolated and naive, fell last, offering little resistance. By 221 BCE, the map had changed. Zheng now ruled the first unified Chinese empire. But peace was a corpse beneath the banquet table. His methods left the land trembling. He adopted the title Shi Huang, first emperor, not king, not mortal. He compared himself to heaven itself, claiming divine mandate and eternal dominion. His birth name, his past, his mother, all were erased or rebranded to fit this myth. History's pages were rewritten while blood still dried on their margins. He made sure his statues would last forever, chiseled in granite, cloaked in empire. But here's the darker truth. The boy king never stopped being the frightened child of Zhao. His empire was built not from confidence, but fear, of rebellion, of obscurity, of mortality, and that fear became a system. At court, ministers dared not breathe without instruction. One misstep meant execution, exile, or worse. Li Si, the Grand Chancellor, institutionalized terror with bureaucratic precision. Spy networks blossomed across provinces, neighbors watched neighbors, children reported parents. Loyalty became a currency, betrayal a survival skill. The emperor did not merely conquer enemies, he annihilated memory itself. He sent emissaries to every corner of the realm, gathering old texts, surveying speech, preparing the great purge of knowledge. But wait, it gets worse. Even the tombs of conquered kings were desecrated. Their corpses dug up, stripped of regalia, burned. He believed history was a threat, memory a rival emperor, and yet, to the peasants, he offered stability, roads, coinage, weights, a common script. It was order, yes, but the kind that demands silence in exchange for breath. His armies were relentless but efficient. His rule was feared but enduring. The common people endured forced relocations, grain quotas, and labor drafts. Many believed they were building a better future. Many did not live long enough to find out. And through it all, Yingzheng, now Shi Huangdi, grew colder. He trusted no one, not generals, not scribes, not even his sons. It said he would disguise himself and wander the empire to hear the people's whispers. But no whisper ever softened him. At the age of 38, he was supreme over all under heaven, and isolated in a palace of echoes. The dragon throne was his, but it sat atop bones. No advisors could sway him. No voices could reach him. No mother's love remained to tether him to softness. He had become the embodiment of the state, immortal in ambition, lethal in memory. His childhood trauma became national architecture. The bastard orphan of Zhao became a god by force, but a man still haunted by shadows. Even the stars were bent to his will. Astrologers who predicted ill omens were executed. And in all this grandeur, there was always a trace of desperation. He hunted alchemists who promised immortality. He sought secret elixirs. He consulted magicians. But nothing would ever undo the terrors of his youth. So he buried them. In policies, in palaces, in fear, his legacy, etched in law and blood, was one of contradictions. Stability through cruelty, unity through devastation. And yet historians would later call him necessary. This is where the story turns. not to the glories of unification, but to the price of erasing opposition. For every city he pacified, a library burned. For every province he ruled, a family grieved. The first emperor rose not by divine grace, but by drowning chaos in calculated terror. His throne was earned, not inherited. His empire secured not by virtue, but by violence. The question is not whether he built China, but whether what he built was ever truly alive. And if it was, how many had to die to give it breath? The year was 221 BCE, and all under heaven now bent to one name, Shi Huangdi. The wars were over, but the peace was engineered, not gifted. China was unified, yes, but only through fire, blade, and forced silence. What the history books call nation-building was, in truth, one of the bloodiest campaigns of cultural annihilation ever recorded. The emperor didn't just conquer lands, he erased identities. Each defeated kingdom had its archives destroyed, noble families slaughtered, dialects suppressed. Uniformity was not a goal, it was a doctrine of fear. Roads were widened not just for trade, but for armies to march faster, for rebellions to be crushed before they took breath. The empire introduced standardized coinage, yes, but in practice, this meant the old currencies were melted down, their holders often executed as counterfeiters. Written characters were unified, but the stories those characters once told were lost to the flames. The emperor's scribes created a new lexicon of loyalty. Anything else was treason. Here's the disturbing part. The administrative genius that modern China celebrates was forged in mass surveillance. Census records weren't just tools, they were weapons, used to tax, draft, and control. The population was divided into mutual responsibility groups. If one person erred, all paid. This was not society, it was hostage-taking masquerading as order. Laborers were conscripted by the hundreds of thousands to build imperial roads, bridges, canals. Those who resisted were buried in ditches beside their unfinished work. Some of these routes still exist today. Beneath them lie the bones of dissenters. The new provinces, formerly kingdoms, were reorganized into commanderies, stripping local elites of their power. Governors were rotated constantly to prevent local loyalty. Trust was treated as a contagion. Even the military was rotated. Generals recalled abruptly. Soldiers resettled far from their homes. This paranoia had logic. It ensured the emperor stood at the apex of all allegiance. But it also meant entire communities were uprooted for the sake of imperial design. Families were torn apart, sons drafted, fathers imprisoned, wives relocated. And for those who questioned why, the legalist code had an answer: silence or death. The scale of conquest was not merely territorial, it was psychological. Farmers were issued quotas. Those who failed were beaten or branded. Entire villages disappeared for falling behind grain delivery schedules. The emperor's spies reported not only on rebellion, but on laziness, skepticism, even dreams. It is said some dreamed of rival kings, and were executed for it. The Great Wall began here, not as a symbol, but as a scar. Built with the blood of peasants and the mortar of fear, its early stones were laid atop corpses. Some rebelled against the forced labor. They vanished without trial. Others were made examples, nailed to gateposts, eyes gouged, tongues cut. The emperor wanted a nation of order, but first, he demanded a people without memory. He visited each conquered region in grand tours of inspection. But these were theater. Spectacles were staged to show harmony, while rebel heads were displayed behind the scenes. Temples were rededicated to the emperor, ancestors forgotten, gods replaced by state slogans. This is where the story turns again, because beneath all this brutality, a strange reverence began to grow. Some subjects praised the emperor for ending the chaos of the warring states. Others simply learned to love the cage. It was safer than the battlefield. Propagandists were sent to every village, praising the new laws as divine wisdom. Children were taught to thank the emperor for peace, even as their fathers died building it. The elderly learned to bow to the new statues, even if they remembered the kings who fell. To disobey was to endanger your lineage. To conform was to survive. In the new imperial calendar, history restarted at year 1. Everything before was rebranded as disorder. The unification was not a merger. It was a funeral for 6 civilizations. Their languages, music, costumes, absorbed, edited, or erased. The empire didn't just pave roads, it paved over heritage. New edicts banned regional attire. Festivals were centralized or forbidden. In some regions, tombs of fallen kings were desecrated, their names banned from inscription. Entire genealogies were rewritten by court historians to glorify the Qin. Historical memory became the property of the state, and the first emperor, still driven by ghosts of betrayal, ordered statues of former rulers melted into new monuments, bearing only his image. The people began to speak in uniform accents, wear uniform clothes, worship uniform truths. But the trauma remained, whispered in homes, hidden in lullabies, etched in secret behind family walls. Those caught clinging to old identities were publicly shamed, imprisoned, sometimes killed. The dream of unity became a nightmare of perfection. Yet, paradoxically, it worked. The empire held. Roads bustled, trade flourished, banditry declined. But these were fruits of a poisoned tree, cultivated in fear, watered with silence. And the emperor, now mythologized, grew more distant. He trusted only eunuchs and executioners, saw danger in every shadow. And perhaps he was right to, because even as the empire grew rich, resentment boiled just beneath the surface. The conquered were not pacified, they were waiting for the moment when the emperor's immortality would prove a lie. But for now, all under heaven bent the knee, and from his marble throne, Shi Huangdi smiled, unaware that the same tools he used to build unity would soon tear his empire apart. In 221 BCE, after decades of conquest, Yingzheng crowned himself not as king, but as something entirely new. He rejected the ancient title of Wang, used by the rulers of the old Zhou dynasty. Instead, he proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, the first August divine emperor. The term was stitched from Huang, meaning majestic, and Dai, a reference to mythic sage, kings of legend. It was a linguistic coronation, a break with the mortal past. No longer would rulers be of the earth, they would be of the heavens. His name was no longer his own. Even Yingzheng was banned from common use. He was not merely a man now, he was the law, the center of gravity for the cosmos itself. Court rituals changed to reflect this divinity. Officials crawled to speak, temples were rededicated. His words were engraved on bronze steles across the empire, each a sermon in stone. But this wasn't just ego, it was engineering. The emperor knew that names shape minds. To control the language was to control the people. He had the empire divided into commanderies, ruled by imperial appointees, loyal not to lineage, but to title. The ancestral fiefdoms that once bound families together were dissolved. Clan loyalties were replaced with bureaucratic obedience. The first emperor's edicts outlawed hereditary rule outside his own bloodline. Loyalty to the past was treason to the present. To enforce this, a bureaucracy of scribes, judges, and informants was created, unequaled in its scope. Every district, every village, every mouth now spoke with imperial sanction, or not at all. The emperor's seal became sacred. To forge it was death, to question it was sedition. He commissioned vast statues of himself, chiseled into cliffs, displayed in courts, stamped on coins. Travelers could go from the eastern sea to the western deserts and see only one face, his. But here's the truly disturbing part. This wasn't just about unification. It was about the erasure of identity beneath a single immortal persona. His throne room was engineered with symbolism, black stone tiles representing the underworld, golden dragons climbing from pillars like twisted serpents of destiny. Above him, carved in the ceiling, the constellations, rearranged to place his birth star at the center. He rewrote the calendar to begin with his reign. The world was reborn in his image. His court astrologers were tasked with finding omens of divine favor and silencing those who found signs of doom. Those who reported bad omens were jailed, exiled, or executed. Even dreams became a political act. Those who dreamed of rebellion were arrested. The emperor's own obsession with immortality bled into policy. He believed himself destined to live forever and began speaking of himself in the third person. His ministers followed suit. The Son of Heaven could not be addressed directly. Every word to the throne passed through layers of euphemism and ritual. His own children, some accounts suggest, feared to speak in his presence. And yet, for the people, he became a myth, untouchable, unknowable, infallible. But it was a myth enforced by terror. Prisoners were branded with their crimes. Dissenters were mutilated or exiled. Statues of former kings were destroyed or hidden. Books that named rival rulers were burned. The past itself was rewritten to show a single arc, history bending inevitably toward him. He wasn't merely building an empire, he was building eternity. But every edifice of eternity he raised was a tomb for those who remembered another time. The emperor's tomb, still unopened today, is said to hold rivers of mercury, crafted to mirror the stars. His desire was not just to be remembered, but to be unavoidable. And in some ways, he succeeded. The imperial cult built around him would echo through dynasties. Later, rulers would claim his model, even as they denounced his cruelty. Modern textbooks praise his reforms but whisper his atrocities. His Terracotta Army stands immortal, but the names of the laborers who built it are lost. The emperor who erased all kings became the yardstick by which all emperors were measured. But beneath the gold leaf of legend lies the granite of totalitarianism. The very structure of his title, First Emperor, was a prophecy of unbroken control. He planned that his successors would be numbered Second Emperor, Third, and so on for 10,000 generations. But the Second Emperor would reign only briefly. Already, the empire cracked beneath the weight of fear. Yet the psychological architecture remained. The uniform titles, the suppression of names, the rewriting of reality, these became tools of power for millennia. And what is power, if not the ability to rename the world? In the name Shi Huang, the orphan from Zhao made himself divine. He destroyed his origins to manufacture destiny. His mother erased, his rivals scattered, his history cleansed. He lived as a man, but demanded to be remembered as a god. And here lies the paradox. The more he sought immortality, the more mortal he became. For buried in every monument is the stench of human cost. Every stone bearing his name sits atop a body that had no voice. This is not just ancient history, it is a mirror. A warning about rulers who call themselves eternal and demand you forget they were ever men, who rewrite truth and force us to pretend we never knew better. The first emperor was not merely a title, it was a system of forgetting. A spell cast on a nation, still humming beneath textbooks and tour guides. But spells break. And when they do, we must remember what we were never supposed to see. In the shadow of Xi'an, under a ceiling of dust and silence, over 8,000 soldiers stand frozen in perfect formation. They are not flesh, but clay, life-sized, armored, and eerily lifelike. This is the famed Terracotta Army, the Emperor's spectral legions, crafted to defend him in death. Tourists marvel at their symmetry, their craftsmanship, their mysterious gaze. But few ask the deeper question. What was the cost of building an army for the dead? According to state records, over 700,000 laborers were conscripted to construct the Emperor's tomb complex. Most were peasants, some were convicts. Others were political prisoners and exiled scholars. They came from every province, marched for miles, then vanished into the imperial necropolis. Many never returned. Their names were never recorded. Some say the tomb claimed them not just through labor, but in death, sealed inside the earth to keep its secrets. It's whispered that artisans who knew the layout of the tomb were executed or buried alive with their work. Why? Because the emperor feared what he loved most: memory and those who could recall it. The soldiers they built were modeled with excruciating detail, each face unique, expressions frozen in obedience. Their armor, hairstyles, even boots reflect different ranks, regions, and battle traditions. It was not just a display of artistry, it was a simulation of control. The emperor could not rule the afterlife without subjects, so he manufactured them. The scale of the mausoleum defies comprehension. 38 square miles, guarded by walls, watchtowers, and burial mounds. Rivers were rerouted, hills were carved, entire ecosystems reshaped to house one man's corpse. The site is still not fully excavated. Archaeologists hesitate to open the central chamber. Ancient texts claim it contains rivers of flowing mercury, stars set in the ceiling, and traps rigged to kill. Some tests confirm high mercury levels in the soil, a chilling clue that legend may be fact. But here's the darker truth. The grandeur of the Terracotta Army is inseparable from its human toll. These soldiers were not built for art. They were built for fear. Fear that the emperor's enemies would follow him into death. Fear that memory would outlive him. That ghosts would rise from unburied pasts. So he made a world where even death served the state. The construction began while he was still consolidating power, suggesting he obsessed with death even at the height of his strength. He didn't wait to die to plan his afterlife. He forced others to build it, brick by brick, lash by lash. And yet, in all their perfection, these clay soldiers are mute. None bear the name of the sculptor. None mention the laborers who carved them. Some lie shattered, scattered by time, or looters, or rebellion. Others stand as if still awaiting command from a master who cannot speak. Tour guides speak of their realism, but not their silence. Museums praise their detail, but not the terror that compelled it. The soldiers' weapons were real, bronze blades still sharp after 2,000 years. But before burial, most were stripped, perhaps to disarm the dead. Or perhaps to prevent a spiritual uprising. Imagine fearing rebellion from your own clay creations. This is not mere ego, it is pathology. The first emperor saw his empire not as a legacy, but as a possession. And he did not release it, even in death. He brought his guards, his ministers, his concubines, some willing, many not, into the tomb with him. There are accounts that hundreds of palace women were sealed in chambers, poisoned or starved. Ritual suicide was sometimes honored. More often, it was enforced. And what of the engineers, the map makers, the men who designed traps and flowing mercury? None walked out. None left diaries. The Terracotta Army stands because they were silenced. And that silence was no accident. It was engineered. Even the landscape around the tomb was sculpted to conceal. Hills were raised artificially to mask the burial mound from foreign eyes. Trees were planted in lines to confuse navigation. It was a ghost factory. The living entombed to manufacture myth. Modern China reveres the site as a symbol of unity and ancient glory. But how many visitors pause to consider the screams behind the clay? The terracotta warriors are silent, but the silence is not peace. It is repression, sealed in lacquer and sand. Beneath every soldier stands a grave. Beneath every triumph, a tragedy. And still, the central chamber remains unopened, not out of reverence, but out of fear of what truth it might confirm. Historians debate, was the river of mercury real? Were the traps ever built? But the more haunting question is, how far did a man go to be remembered as a god? This is where the story turns again, because in seeking immortality through stone, the emperor murdered his own humanity. He turned art into coercion, faith into architecture, history into hostage. The Terracotta Army is not a monument to greatness. It is a mausoleum of madness, a kingdom compressed into a tomb, ruled by a corpse with a god complex. And we, the living, now file through it in quiet awe, rarely asking who paid the price. The emperor may lie beneath the mound, untouched. But above him stands a nation of clay, still echoing the commands of a man who could not let go. The lesson is not in the craftsmanship. It is in the silence. And that silence, terrifying, tragic, total, is the true legacy of Qin Shi Huang. To the modern eye, it is majestic, a ribbon of stone unspooling across the mountains of northern China. To school children, it is taught as a marvel of unity, strength, and national pride. But to those who built it, the Great Wall was a tomb in the making. Its foundations were laid not in celebration, but in dread. Qin Shi Huang ordered its construction not to elevate a nation, but to enclose it. It was the product of fear of barbarians, of rebellion, of the emperor's own mortality. The nomadic Xiongnu threatened the empire's northern frontier, yes. But the emperor's solution was not diplomacy. It was imprisonment on a continental scale. He ordered the linking of pre-existing walls from older states, Zhao, Yan, and Qin, into one vast barrier. It stretched thousands of miles, through desert, mountain, and riverbank. It was not built by engineers, it was built by conscripts. Farmers, criminals, scholars, dragged from homes and sentenced to labor without end. Some were arrested for petty theft, others for dissent. All were treated as disposable. They carried stones on broken backs, dug trenches in frozen soil, and collapsed beneath whips. There were no wages, no rest days, no burial rites. Many died within weeks. Those who lived envied the dead. Local legend says the wall is held together with more than mortar, with human bones. Archaeological findings confirm skeletal remains buried near the foundation. Mass graves hastily covered. Workers too weak to continue were thrown into pits, walled over as construction resumed. The emperor wanted a wall that would last 10,000 years. And he was willing to sacrifice 10,000 lives a month to build it. The project drained resources, displaced communities, and turned provinces into labor camps. Families were torn apart. Sons marched away with no return. Letters from home were forbidden. Escape was punishable by death. Soldiers guarded labor camps, enforcing quotas with brutality. Dissenters were not flogged, they were executed, their heads mounted as warnings. The wall was built by fear, to defend a regime built by fear, and yet it failed its only stated purpose. The Xiongnu continued raiding. The wall slowed them, but never stopped them. Its true function was internal, not protection from outsiders, but containment of insiders. It marked the edge of empire, the line beyond which Qin law held no sway. The wall was psychological, a border not just of geography, but of thought. It told the people, there is nothing beyond us and no escape within. And yet, propaganda flourished. Court historians praised the wall as a symbol of civilization holding back savagery. The emperor's scribes compared it to the Milky Way, dividing order from chaos. But here's where the story turns again, because the real chaos was not beyond the wall, it was inside it. The empire's hunger for obedience consumed its own children. The wall became a mass grave, stretching across dynasties. Even centuries later, new emperors continued to rebuild it, layering oppression atop forgotten corpses. Every brick, every watchtower, every fortress tells a lie of security. Because it was not built for safety, it was built for spectacle. The emperor needed symbols of permanence, proof of divine rule carved into the earth. The wall was his crown of thorns, forced onto the nation's brow. Visitors today walk upon it with cameras and flags, but the ghosts walk beside them, unphotographed, unnamed. Some scholars argue it is not one wall, but many, a patchwork of regimes and empires. That may be true, but the blood began with Qin. His wall was the prototype of state paranoia rendered in stone. It set a precedent that a ruler could bend the land itself to his will, no matter the human toll. The Great Wall was not a defensive structure, it was an imperial scream. A warning to enemies, yes, but louder still, a command to subjects. Obey. Even its serpentine path across the mountains mimicked the dragon, a symbol of Qin's divine authority. It was built to be visible, to cast shadows on villages, to haunt the horizon with imperial might. There are records of workers deliberately throwing themselves from the heights to escape. Some buried secret messages into the mortar, pleas for future generations to remember their suffering. Those messages have rarely been found, but their silence speaks volumes. For what is a monument, if not a curated lie? The wall endures, but the truth was buried beneath it. Every step atop it crushes forgotten names. And in schoolrooms, those names are not spoken. The wall is called a miracle. The deaths it consumed are called irrelevant. But no structure that costs hundreds of thousands of lives can be neutral. It is an altar of blood disguised as a boundary. The first emperor may have believed he was securing eternity, but eternity, like tyranny, cannot be built on unmarked graves, and still the myth persists. Because to question the wall is to question the very foundation of unity, of empire, of pride. But ask yourself, can a civilization built on bones ever truly stand tall, or is it forever at risk of collapse from the weight of truths it dares not remember? Every year, millions visit the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang in Xi'an, wide-eyed, reverent, unaware. School tours arrive in uniform lines. Tour guides speak in careful tones. Cameras flash beneath the stone gaze of the emperor. To most, it is a marvel, a place of history, legacy, and architectural wonder. But beneath every flag-waving tourist lies a graveyard. The mausoleum is not merely a monument, it is a sanctuary of forgetting. Inside, the emperor rests in secrecy, his central tomb unopened, his design hidden for over 2,000 years. Why? Because the legend terrifies even the modern state. Ancient texts say rivers of mercury surround his coffin, and crossbows rigged with hair triggers await intruders. Scientific surveys confirm abnormally high mercury levels in the soil, matching the myth too precisely to dismiss. But the real trap may not be mechanical, it may be ideological. To disturb the tomb is to disturb the myth, and myths, once cracked, can collapse nations. The state preserves the site, but not the full story. Official signage speaks of unification, innovation, legacy. It does not speak of mass graves, of book burnings, of children dying under a wall they were forced to build. The tour pamphlets are sanitized, the textbooks even more so. In the national curriculum, Qin Shi Huang is praised as a necessary tyrant. His cruelty is framed as harsh medicine, his mass surveillance as proto-modern governance, his book burnings are downplayed as ideological housekeeping, and the execution of over 460 scholars? Some say it never happened, others say it was exaggerated. All say, let's move on. But what if moving on means moving over the bodies? In official museums, his reign is portrayed as a golden age of unification. The emperor is called a visionary, obsessed, perhaps, but brilliant. His palace of Epang is reconstructed in models, but the voices of those who built it are never simulated. His legalist advisors are quoted for their discipline, not their brutality. It's the same silence you find in any shrine built atop suffering. The pain is beneath the tile. The narrative is polished and airbrushed. Even the Terracotta Army is presented not as a work of coercion, but as a masterstroke of artistry. No child visiting the site is told that many of the artisans may have been executed after completion. No diagram includes the quarters where concubines were starved to death after the emperor's burial. The mausoleum is not a lesson, it is a brand. A tourism product stamped with the Qin seal, monetized, and scrubbed clean of its ghosts. But here's where the story turns. The silence is not just about history, it is about control. To question the narrative is to question the entire architecture of national pride. In China today, open criticism of Qin Shi Huang is risky, especially if it suggests parallels with modern governance. Scholars tread carefully. Dissidents are silenced. Historical revision becomes a crime against unity. And unity, as always, is the shield behind which empires hide. The emperor's legacy becomes a mirror. Look too deeply, and you see things the state would prefer stay unseen. The construction of national identity demands heroes, even if they were once monsters. So Qin is repackaged. Not a tyrant, but a tough father figure. Not a destroyer of culture, but a refiner of it. Not a murderer, but a misunderstood reformer. But myths, once embalmed, resist decomposition, and in the dark corners of the mausoleum, the bones still whisper. Every artifact excavated is a fragment of the truth, but without context, it is just a relic. The emperor's script reforms are praised, but no child is told that minority dialects were suppressed to enforce them. His standardized roads are admired, but the bodies buried beneath them are left uncounted. His name is etched in granite, but never paired with a ledger of his atrocities. In textbooks, he is the father of a nation. In truth, he buried 6 civilizations to father one. He is called the unifier. But unity forged through terror is not harmony. It is silence mistaken for peace. The greatest myth is not the one entombed beneath Mercury. It is the one written across classroom walls and guidebooks, that greatness excuses cruelty. That oppression, if efficient enough, becomes leadership. That monuments justify the means. But beneath every shrine built to Qin, a darker altar remains, one of memory, waiting to be unearthed. What would we find if we opened the tomb? Not just mercury or traps, but the unbearable truth of a civilization founded on suppression, a truth that threatens not just the past, but the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. This is not just about one emperor. It's about every state that builds museums atop massacre sites. Every curriculum that praises efficiency while ignoring its victims. Every flag waved in front of a monument built by slaves. Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum is a marvel, but it is also a mausoleum of conscience. It is the physical manifestation of a question. How much suffering are we willing to forget for the sake of pride? How many atrocities become acceptable once they're buried under tourism revenue and patriotic pageantry? The emperor lies undisturbed, but not because he is sacred. He lies untouched because his myth must remain sealed. because opening that tomb might require opening our eyes. And the silence of 700,000 laborers may finally echo loud enough to be heard, but only if we dare to listen, not to the tour guides, not to the textbooks, but to the silence itself. What does it take to erase a civilization's memory? Not just its soldiers or cities, but its soul. In 213 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang gave the order that would haunt generations: burn the books. It wasn't metaphorical. It was fire, real fire, consuming ink and parchment, thought and philosophy, history and dissent. The flames did not discriminate. Confucian classics vanished. Poetry vanished. Legal commentaries, historical records, medical treatises, all gone. Entire libraries transformed into ash. Smoke curling upward like the ghosts of forbidden ideas. Why would an emperor destroy the wisdom of his own people? Because that wisdom questioned him. Because words are dangerous to tyrants. And because forgetting is the surest way to control. Qin Shi Huang had just unified China under the brutal order of legalism. Legalism was more than law, it was doctrine. It demanded obedience, silence, conformity, and it left no room for rival truths. Confucius taught virtue, compassion, moral governance. Legalism taught punishment, surveillance, fear. The emperor made his choice. He chose fear. He ordered that all texts not aligned with legalist dogma be collected and destroyed. Regional governors and scholars were told to surrender their scrolls or be accused of treason. Homes were raided. Families were interrogated. Secret caches of books were hunted like contraband. This wasn't censorship. This was cultural genocide. The edict declared that only manuals on agriculture, medicine, and Qin law could be preserved. All else was treasonous. Even history was not spared. Qin Shi Huang demanded that history begin with him. Earlier dynasties? Myth. Heroes and philosophers before him? Irrelevant. The past became a blank canvas. And he, the sole author. This is what isn't taught in school. That China's first emperor didn't just conquer land, he conquered memory. The burning wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Generations would grow up without their intellectual inheritance. A people made to forget what they once knew. But wait, it gets worse. The book burnings were only the beginning. The flames that consumed paper would soon reach flesh. Scholars who defied the order were labeled subversives. Those who dared to hide scrolls, quote Confucius, or question Qin's decrees would be silenced. Not in courtrooms, but in mass graves. But that's the next chapter. For now, imagine this. A night sky over the imperial capital, filled not with stars, but with smoke. The cries of the educated, drowned by crackling fire. Fathers weeping as they feed family scrolls to the flames. Children watching stories disappear before they've ever been told. This is the price of tyranny. Not just the body, but the mind enslaved. The Edict of 213 BCE was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. A model for every despot who would ever fear the written word. Hitler would burn books in Berlin. Mao would ban them in Beijing. But Qin did it first. He taught the world that to rule absolutely, one must first erase absolutely. Every poem destroyed was a whisper lost. Every scroll burned was a question silenced. And every silence became a stone in his empire. This is where the story turns. From emperor to arsonist of memory. From unifier of China to destroyer of its conscience. What happens when a ruler fears ideas more than armies? He burns the truth and buries it beneath the ashes of history. The fires of censorship had barely cooled when the emperor reached for something colder: the grave. In the wake of the book burnings, Qin Shi Huang turned his fury toward the minds behind the ink. Over 460 scholars were summoned under false pretenses. They thought they were attending a court debate. They thought the emperor still valued wisdom. Instead, they were led to pits outside the capital, and there, they were buried alive. This was not symbolic. It was systemic extermination. The execution of thought by the execution of thinkers. The emperor called them corrupt Confucians. He said they spread lies, defied unity, threatened order. But their real crime? They remembered. They remembered dynasties that ruled with virtue. They remembered moral codes older than legalism. They remembered a time when rulers were questioned, not worshipped. Qin Shi Huang could not allow that memory to live. And so, he buried it. With every scholar buried, a truth was silenced. A debate lost. A lineage of thought severed. But the horror didn't end with burial. Some scholars were forced into labor camps. Others were mutilated, tongues cut, faces branded. A few were paraded through towns as warnings. The message was clear. Ideas can get you killed. This is what they don't want you to know. That Qin Shi Huang's empire was not just built with stone. It was built with silence. The silence of scholars who dared to speak, and the enforced silence of those who dared not. Families of the accused were not spared. Collective punishment meant wives, children, even neighbors suffered. A word spoken in trust could lead to chains. Paranoia became policy. Dissent became death. Even the court historians were afraid to write. Records from the Qin period are eerily sparse. Why? Because truth became treason. And treason meant the pit. Here's the truly disturbing part. The emperor didn't see this as cruelty. He saw it as purification. The empire, he believed, needed to be cleansed of corruption. And to him, corruption meant thinking independently. He was not the first ruler to fear philosophers, but he may have been the first to industrialize their annihilation. Scholars were not just killed, they were erased, their names lost, their teachings scattered, their legacies hijacked by state propaganda. And yet, their silence echoes louder than their words. Every modern regime that jails a poet or censors a textbook stands in Qin's shadow. He made intellectual extermination a blueprint, not an exception. And still, tourists visit his tomb in awe. Still, textbooks in China call him a visionary. But what is vision without truth? What is a legacy built atop unmarked graves? The soil around Xi'an is said to be rich in iron, but perhaps it is rich in something else. Bone, the crushed remains of those who dared to remember differently. This is how an empire kills not just a man, but an idea. With pits instead of podiums, with silence instead of argument, with fear instead of dialogue. Qin Shi Huang didn't just murder scholars, he murdered conversation itself. And in doing so, he planted a seed of suppression that would blossom in every autocrat to follow. The question is, do we still hear the silence? Or have we too learned to forget? Tyranny does not thrive on brutality alone. It thrives on compliance. And compliance is born from fear. Qin Shi Huang didn't just command armies, he engineered obedience. He built a system where trust dissolved, where every eye might be a spy, where your neighbor, your servant, even your child could be your executioner. Welcome to the first surveillance state in recorded history. The emperor's regime pioneered collective punishment. If one man disobeyed, his entire family paid. If one village withheld taxes, the next one burned. If a scholar questioned the law, his colleagues vanished. This wasn't justice. It was terror codified. Legalism, the ruling philosophy, taught that humans are selfish and evil by nature. Therefore, only harsh laws and constant oversight could maintain order. And so, the state watched. In cities, markets, and temples, informants blended with crowds. In rural villages, elders reported to magistrates. Children were told to expose their parents. Silence became suspicious. Kindness became questionable. Privacy, impossible. But wait, it gets worse. Qin Shi Huang implemented a strict registry system. Every household documented, every profession licensed, every movement tracked. Travel required state permission. Marriage required approval. Names were standardized, accents policed, dialects crushed. Language itself was weaponized to enforce unity. Bureaucrats, branded with titles, patrolled the empire like living laws. They reported everything upward: failures, rumors, discontent. And above them all, the emperor, cloaked in divine authority, immune to scrutiny. This is what isn't taught in school. That Qin's empire was not just militarily strong, it was psychologically suffocating. Surveillance wasn't the side effect of order, it was the foundation of it. Dissent was detected before it was spoken. Preemptive punishment became policy. If a man seemed troubled, he was questioned. If a woman wept too often, she was accused. If a teacher hesitated during a lesson, students took note. This wasn't civilization. This was managed paranoia. The emperor called it harmony. But harmony, in his empire, meant total control. And control was absolute only when freedom was zero. Here's the truly disturbing part. Qin Shi Huang's system worked temporarily. Crime rates dropped. Rebellion quieted. The empire appeared unified. But beneath the stillness was suffocation. Citizens didn't love their emperor. They feared him. And fear breeds silence, not loyalty. Loyalty built on silence collapses fast, which is exactly what happened after his death. But even in collapse, his blueprint endured. Centralized power, institutionalized fear, state loyalty enforced by informants, prisons, and propaganda. Does any of this sound familiar? Modern regimes still use his playbook. North Korea, the Stasi of East Germany, the surveillance grid in Xinjiang, all echoes of Qin. He was the architect of authoritarianism long before it had a name, a ruler who understood. To dominate the body, you must first dominate the mind. And to dominate the mind, you must kill trust. Between citizens, between families, between the governed and the truth. Qin Shi Huang's empire died quickly, but the fear he engineered outlived him. It lives in every silence chosen over honesty, in every camera disguised as protection, in every citizen who forgets what freedom feels like. For a man who silenced history, Qin Shi Huang was terrified of becoming part of it. He feared death not as a man fears pain, but as a god fears falling. Obsessed with immortality, he searched for alchemy, not legacy. He scoured the land for sages and sorcerers, sent ships to distant islands seeking elixirs, ordered expeditions to seas never charted, and when the sages failed him, he killed them too. But he clung to one solution: mercury, liquid metal, heavy and toxic. He believed it could preserve life. He drank it daily. And with every dose, his veins grew sick. Madness crept in, paranoia, hallucinations, sudden rages. But his fear of death only deepened. So he built a tomb meant to defy it, a city underground. Rivers of mercury crafted to mimic China's geography. Crossbows rigged to fire at intruders long after his breath had stilled. Walls of bronze, chambers of jade. And guarding it all, an army of clay, thousands of terracotta soldiers, each with a unique face, not to inspire the living, but to terrify the dead. This was not a mausoleum. It was a fortress, a final empire where no rebellion could reach him. But for all his preparations, death came anyway. Quietly, during an imperial tour in 210 BCE, he died far from the capital, surrounded by yes-men too afraid to speak the truth. For days, his death was hidden. The royal cart was packed with rotting fish to mask the smell of his decaying body. Letters were forged in his name. Commands issued in a dead man's voice. The lie had to last until they reached the capital, because an empire built on fear collapses when its source disappears. The irony is devastating. The man who ruled as if he were eternal died in secrecy, decomposing in his own caravan. Not honored, not mourned, managed. Here's what they don't want you to know: that the same emperor who made history tremble was afraid of being forgotten. He didn't want reverence, he wanted permanence. But Mercury could not preserve the soul. And fear cannot outlive the fearful. This is where the story turns again. From emperor to corpse, from god to ghost. His tomb, still unopened, lies beneath a hill in Shaanxi province. Local legends speak of poison traps and rivers that still flow, of a grave too dangerous to disturb. Scientists have detected abnormal mercury levels in the soil. The legends, it seems, might be true, but the Chinese government has never excavated it. Too costly, they say. Too risky, or perhaps too revealing. What secrets lie beneath that mound? What horrors was he trying to bury with himself? A map of all who were erased? A record of crimes long denied? Or just a man's final attempt to control the story after death? This is the truly disturbing part. His fear of dying gave us one of the world's greatest archaeological enigmas, and also one of its most brutal legacies. He feared death so much, he reshaped life around it. He couldn't stop dying, so he tried to control how he was remembered. But history has its own judgment, and no tomb, no matter how grand, can contain the truth forever. Not even if it's lined with mercury, not even if it's guarded by ghosts. Qin Shi Huang wanted to be immortal. He succeeded, but not in the way he hoped. He lives on, not as a divine emperor, but as a caution, a warning, that the more we fear death, the more we risk destroying life. Qin Shi Huang believed he had built something eternal, a dynasty forged in iron and fear, but eternity lasted only 3 years. That is how long his empire survived him, 3 years between his death and the dynasty's collapse. After 2 decades of total control, it unraveled almost overnight. The reason? His iron grip had no human heart. His son, Qin Shi, inherited the throne, but not the power. He was a puppet, controlled by 2 ambitious ministers, Zhao Gao and Li Si. One was a cunning eunuch, the other an architect of terror. Together, they concealed the emperor's death, falsified the will, installed Qin Shi over the rightful heir, and began a reign even more paranoid than the first. But paranoia, unchecked, becomes incompetence. Zhao Gao demanded loyalty tests. Officials were ordered to recognize deer as horses, literally. Those who objected were executed. The empire turned against reason itself. Meanwhile, rebellions flared across the provinces. Farmers, soldiers, even former allies rose up. The forced labor for the Great Wall, the tomb, the palaces, had bred deep resentment. Peasants who had buried sons in state projects now picked up arms. Cities that had once surrendered to Qin now defied it, and there was no one left to inspire fear. Qin Shi had no charisma, no strategy, No divine aura. Just the title of emperor, and none of the awe. The rebellions grew. Liu Bang, a peasant turned general, seized the moment. He would become the founder of the Han dynasty. But first, he marched on the crumbling capital. The Qin court, paralyzed by internal betrayals, collapsed. In 207 BCE, the Qin dynasty fell. The palace burned. The emperor killed himself. The dream of eternal empire died with him. This is what isn't taught in school, that the most tightly controlled regime in ancient history collapsed under its own weight. Not from invasion, not from famine, from within. The system Qin Shi Huang created worked only under his shadow. Without him, it became a mausoleum of terror with no architect. But here's the truly disturbing part. The tools of tyranny didn't vanish. They were inherited. Centralized bureaucracy, collective punishment, surveillance networks. These systems lived on, not as ruins, but as templates. The Han dynasty adopted many of Qin's methods, refined them, softened the edges, but the blueprint remained. The ghost of Qin lingered in the machinery of governance. His empire died, but the idea of total control survived. The Qin dynasty became a warning, but also a model, for every regime that valued unity over humanity, order over freedom, obedience over wisdom. Qin Shi Huang's failure wasn't just political, it was moral. He built something powerful, but not something good. And without goodness, power rots. His dynasty rotted quickly, but his shadow stretches across centuries. In every ruler who fears the truth, in every state that chooses fear over justice. Qin's empire is gone, but the world it made, still here. Qin Shi Huang died alone, paranoid and unloved. His empire crumbled within 3 years. His dynasty left behind ash and sorrow. But that is not how he is remembered. In modern China, his name is revered. His face adorns documentaries. His Terracotta Army draws millions of tourists. Textbooks call him a visionary, a founding father, a necessary force for unity. But this is not remembrance. It is reinvention, a myth manufactured by those who benefit from silence. What if the truth was never truly buried? What if it was repackaged, sanitized for public consumption, glorified by the very state he once modeled in terror? Here's what they don't want you to know, that the myth of Qin Shi Huang is not about history. It's about power. Power to reshape the past. Power to justify the present. In state-run media, his atrocities are softened. The book burnings are called reforms. The scholar executions, stability measures. His surveillance state, a model for law and order. In Chinese schools, students learn of his brilliance, of his role in national unification. Rarely do they learn about the 460 scholars buried alive. Rarely do they hear about the forced labor, about the tombs filled with corpses, not treasures, about the mercury rivers meant to poison trespassers forever. Instead, they see him as a symbol of strength. Strength rebranded as virtue, brutality reframed as necessity. But wait, it gets worse. Criticizing Qin Shi Huang in modern China is often taboo. Censorship silences academic scrutiny. Media avoids uncomfortable truths. Museums omit the full record. His myth is curated, not by accident, but by design. Because to admit his crimes would be to question the system that celebrates him. And that system still fears dissent. Still prioritizes unity over truth. Still prefers obedient memory over honest reckoning. This is where the story turns. From ancient terror to modern illusion. from a tyrant buried in secrecy to a legend polished by state approval. But truth resists burial. It leaks through cracks in monuments, through whispers in textbooks, through ruins that cannot lie. The Terracotta Army does not smile. It stands in silence. It guards a man who feared the afterlife more than the people he ruled. A man who ruled not with love, but with erasure, and whose erasure was never complete. His myth is powerful, but not invincible. Every question posed by history chips away at it. Every scholar who remembers the massacres reclaims a piece of the truth. Every voice that challenges the myth breaks the silence he left behind. This is the truly disturbing part, that the tools used to glorify Qin Shi Huang are the very tools he once forged in tyranny. Propaganda, revisionism, fear disguised as reverence. The emperor who killed truth is now protected by a lie. But we do not have to believe it. We do not have to forget the bones beneath the marble, the ash beneath the scrolls, the terror behind the statues. Qin Shi Huang was not a god. He was not a hero. He was a man who feared death, truth, and memory. And so he tried to kill all three. But here you are, still remembering. And that is how his myth dies. Qin Shi Huang unified China, but at what cost? He built walls so high they touched legend. He buried scholars so deep they vanished from memory. He forged laws in steel and governed with terror. And for that he is called visionary. His monuments still stand. But the souls they crushed, those do not speak. Unless we choose to listen, this is the story they don't want told. Not because it is old, but because it is familiar, because it reveals what power does when left unchecked. It builds, then it silences. Then it glorifies, and finally it repeats. Qin Shi Huang is not just a man of the past. He is a mirror held to our present. Every regime that burns books inherits his flame. Every state that silences dissent echoes his tomb. Every society that praises the strong while forgetting the broken walks in his footsteps. He is a paradox, the father of a nation and the executioner of its soul. His accomplishments are undeniable, but so is his cruelty. History often remembers the builders of walls, not the bones buried within them, but every stone in Qin's empire was laid over silence, every policy written in the ink of erasure, every triumph resting on a grave. And yet, he is celebrated, not because we forgive him, but because we've grown used to forgetting. This is the final warning. When we glorify the past without reckoning with its darkness, we do not preserve greatness. We preserve delusion. And delusion has a cost. In every mausoleum that draws tourists, in every textbook that omits atrocity, in every statue that offers no context, we see the face of the emperor, but not the scars he left behind. If history is memory, then forgetting is death. But if history is truth, then remembering is justice. And justice demands more than monuments. It demands honesty, courage, and the willingness to speak what was buried. This series was never about the past alone. It was about the present built atop it. Qin Shi Huang does not rise from the grave, but his legacy does. In every government that values power over people, in every citizen afraid to speak, in every silence mistaken for peace. But silence is not peace. It is the ash left behind when fire consumes truth. The emperor is gone, his dynasty extinct. But his shadow still moves through the world, through systems, through statues, through stories that choose comfort over confrontation. The question now is not about him. It is about us. Will we remember the bones beneath the marble? Will we question the myths we're told? Will we demand truth, even when it's inconvenient. Because if we don't, another Qin will rise, another tomb will be built, another generation will forget, and history, once again, will become silence. But not today. Today, we remember, not to praise, but to reckon, not to glorify, but to finally, fully tell the truth.